And welcome back, students, as we get into our last lesson for this chapter. We have a real quick lesson here. We're going to quickly discuss rethrowing an exception and some other things to kind of look at as we dive into exceptions. So getting started here with the last lesson, let's recall that catch block can contain code that throws an exception. Now, in rare cases, you may find it useful to catch an exception, and then depending upon the string produced by getMessage, or depending on something else, decide to throw the same or a different exception for handling further up the chain of exception handling blocks. Right. So let's look at an example here with the assertion class, or the assertion error class, excuse me. So when we discussed the assert operator and assertion checking back in programming 1, we said if your program contains an assertion check and the assertion check fails, your program is going to end with an error message. Well, this statement from our perspective back then, it was more or less true, but it was incomplete. What actually happens is that an object of the class assertion error is thrown. If it is not caught in a catch block, your program ends with an error message. However, if you wish, you can catch it in a catch block, although it's not a very common thing to do. So if you want, rather than your assertion checks terminating your program, you can write code that will catch that error and handle it from there. Now, the assertion error class is in the java.lang package, and so you don't have to do any kind of special importing in order to use this additional check. As the name suggests, the assertion error is derived from the class error, so you're not required to catch it in a catch block or declare it in a throws clause. Now, here's one that we're probably very familiar with, which is the array index out of bounds exception. We haven't really talked about this one, but you are probably familiar with seeing it, from handling arrays. Now, if your program attempts to use an array index that is out of bounds, an array index out of bounds exception is thrown and your program ends, unless the exception is caught within a catch block. Now, array index out of bounds exception is a descendant of the class runtime exception, and so it needs not be caught or accounted for with the throws clause. This sort of exception normally indicates there's something wrong with your code and means that you need to fix your code, not really catch an exception. So even though, yes, we can catch this and keep the program from crashing, it usually means that, hey, there's something actually wrong with how your code is structured. Probably should go troubleshoot that. Thus, an array index out of bounds exception normally functions a little bit more like a runtime error message than that of a regular exception. All right, it'd be like, if you divide by 0 and you get divided by 0 error. Well, divide by 0 error probably means that you're trying to input something and it's calculating out a dividing by 0. So it means you might have to go and check your numbers. That one you could handle with some exception handling, and say, hey, you inputted a 0, try again, kind of thing. But with the array index out of bounds exception, it's definitely something that you want to go and address in your code rather than just trying to say, use a catch block. Now, the array index out of bounds exception is, of course, in the standard java.lang, and so requires no import statement should you decide to actually use it by name. But again, this is one of the ones where you're probably going to want to fix your code rather than just like, hey, I'm going to use a catch block to keep my program from crashing. And that wraps it up, folks. Like I said, kind of a quick one today, and we will see you next chapter when we get into input and output.